Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is your brother Hassam Munir, and I am presenting to you today about a very special person, a very special Muslim in history, someone who's very important in the history of science and mathematics and the different fields of knowledge, as well as in Islamic history. And this person is commonly known as Al-Khwarizmi, but his full name, or at least a significant section of his actual full name, is Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. Abu Ja'far being his kunya, his patronymic, sort of his nickname, assumedly based on a son that he had named Ja'far, and his name is Muhammad ibn Musa, and he's known by a few different descriptive kind of parts of his name, one of which of course is Al-Khwarizmi. Khwarazm is an area which still exists today, of course, is just not called that anymore, but the section of northern Iran, northwestern Afghanistan, some of the Central Asian states such as parts of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. So that whole region used to be called Khwarizm, and that's most likely where his family originated from. And some of the historians, they also mention other details about his life, and I'll mention them right now because we don't have very many details of his life, that he himself was potentially born in a small town close to Baghdad in Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in Iraq. So that's where he was born, probably sometime in the mid to late 700s. We're not actually sure exactly what his birth date was. And also that his family at least was probably of Majusi background, so Zoroastrian background, which of course many of the Persians and the Persianate cultures before Islam, as the gradual conversion to Islam was happening in those early centuries of Muslim rule in the region, it's likely that his parents or his grandparents perhaps were Zoroastrians, and then at some point down the line his family converted to Islam, and he himself, we do know, was a devout Muslim. Why? Because in many of his works, including the work which we'll talk about, which has given us the word algebra, which is his most famous sort of accomplishment, he does have a very pious kind of introduction, a very pious kind of dedication, and what he says about his motivation for doing that kind of work and developing those fields of knowledge. You know, a lot of praise for Allah and sending salat and salam upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as even like the practical uses for which he was developing this knowledge are very much tied to the Islamic tradition. So like I said, he was born at some point in the 700s. He died after 847, so we don't know very much about his life at all, right? Just the bare bone kind of details. And he lived during the time of the Abbasid rulers, Al-Ma'mun and Al-Vatiq. So Al-Ma'mun is probably the more famous one, the son of Harun al-Rashid, who is even more famous. So these are the early Abbasid rulers in the Abbasid dynasty, and they had established the capital of the Abbasid Empire, the Muslim empire of the time. They had established the capital in the city of Baghdad in Iraq, which is where Al-Khwarizmi most likely lived for much of his life. And within that city of Baghdad, they had established what was known as the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, which was not so much a building, not a physical house, but more so like, you know, kind of like the concept of a university, right? Which is a collection of a collection of buildings, a collection of institutions that work together to develop knowledge in many different fields. So libraries and, you know, copying houses and paper production factories and bookstores and sort of these places where scientists and thinkers and mathematicians and artists, etc., would all gather, and they would discuss ideas and they would share knowledge and develop knowledge. So this is kind of like the general description of this House of Wisdom. And Al-Khwarizmi in those early years of the 800s was one of the leading figures within the Bayt al-Hikmah in the city of Baghdad. Now, what are some of his famous works? Now, the most famous of his works is, of course, Al-Kitab Al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab Al-Jabr Wal-Muqabala, right? So this is, of course, as you can see, the name is a very lengthy name, and really the key word to grasp there is Al-Jabr, which is the Arabic formula, right? We have al something, which means the something, right? And then the other key word to grasp there as well is al-muqabala. So what does al-jabr mean? And of course, as you can already guess, this is where the word algebra comes from, the modern word algebra. So al-jabr means restoration, or it means completion, right? Restoring and completing an equation, basically, is what is being referred to here. And al-muqabala means balancing. So if you're at the stage where you've already started to learn some basic algebra, you know, balancing both sides of the equation, simplifying the equation so that it can be solved easily, these are the concepts being alluded to here. And what was really the accomplishment of Al-Khwarizmi in this book that he wrote, and for which he's known as the father of algebra or the founder of algebra. You know, people express that different ways. But it wasn't that he came up with the more complex system to develop these mathematical equations and use them to solve problems, but his actual achievement was that he took what previous civilizations had done in terms of figuring out how to do these calculations, and he simplified the process into some very basic rules that could be applied to many different situations, which, as we know, is standardization. So he sort of standardized the process of how you solve these mathematical problems, and he was very practically oriented, very much oriented towards practical benefit of doing this kind of work. And some of the practical benefits that he himself suggests that could be applicable in his time, of course, we know today that, like, you know, you can think of just about anything and somehow in some way algebra plays a role, and complex mathematics that have been developed based on algebraic rules play a role in every single aspect of our lives, right? And so, but Al-Khwarizmi, during his time, he suggests that, okay, this kind of calculation is beneficial when you're trying to calculate inheritance. We know Islam has inheritance laws. Sometimes those inheritance questions can become complicated. So one example actually from the book itself is if someone were to pose a question that a man has passed away and he has left 1/9 of all of his wealth, so 1/9 of all of his wealth to a stranger, and the remainder has to be divided among his mother, his wife, his 2 brothers, and his 2 sisters. So how should the wealth be divided? How much of a share does each person get? Now, there's so many different laws, Islamic laws, that are applicable here, which is why you sort of need this complex kind of calculation to figure out how much each person would get out of the man's wealth as their inheritance, right? So for these kind of problems, as well as for calculating distances, as well as for when canals had to be dug for irrigation to sort of make sure that farmland could be kept fertile, you know, calculating the size of the canal, and all these many different kinds of very, very practical benefits, the direction of the Qibla, figuring that out, and that's not so much in this work, but of course his other books were related to this main work that he became most well known for. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind about Al-Khwarizmi, and something to appreciate, is that he was very open-minded to the knowledge of other civilizations, right? And this is so important when we're developing knowledge. You can't develop knowledge when you're isolated. You can't just stay in your own corner and not be open-minded and, you know, not explore what other people in the past, what other civilizations, how did they try to solve problems? How did they try to understand things? You have to keep all of this in mind and then move forward based on that. So one of the things Al-Khwarizmi is credited with is studying in detail the Hindu numerals. Now, nowadays, the 1 to 10 that we have, basically, they're called the Arabic numerals, but that's actually kind of a misunderstanding. They should be called the Arabic Hindu numerals, or really the Hindu numerals, because their origins are actually in pre-Islamic Indian civilization. And it's important for us to acknowledge that and to appreciate the people who did that work prior to Islam. So he wrote a book, for example, that was titled The Book of Addition and Subtraction by the Method of Calculation of the Hindus. And he's going through all of this Hindu mathematical knowledge, and the treatise has survived in some form to this day, that book that he wrote. And it expounds on things like the use of, the Hindu numerals, like I just mentioned, what the implication is of having this system of numbers that goes from 1 to 9, basically like a base 10 decimal system, the place value system. You guys will hear all of these things in math class, right? And then also looking into things such as fractions, square roots, and how all of these different concepts can be applied. He also was in very close contact with Jewish intellectuals, Jewish thinkers of his time, and he actually wrote a book on calculating the Jewish calendar. So again, it shows us his curiosity, his drive for knowledge, his kind of close communication with people of different backgrounds, because everyone from a different background, if they have something that can benefit humanity, then Muslims should be engaged with that and be, welcome to that knowledge and to try to build upon that knowledge even further. Another of Al-Khwarizmi's achievements was in the field of geography. And he actually wrote, by the way, a work, possibly wrote a work on history as well. I won't go into the details of that, but it seems like the work has been completely lost. There's just sort of signs and hints here and there that he also wrote a work on history. Perhaps what would have been unique about that work, some historians of science, they think that he could have made some connections between astronomy and what his knowledge of astronomy and the movements of the planets and the stars, and coordinated that with historical events. Allah knows best the reality, right, of whether that's the way things work or not. But that is something that he may have attempted. And again, we don't know if he actually even did that. That's just something that's a theory. But in terms of geography, he made some interesting kind of contributions. He notably improved the estimates about the size of the Mediterranean Sea, right? So his work on geography was very much focused on latitude and longitude and measuring distances, basically, and measuring the area of certain things. So how big is the Mediterranean Sea? How big is Africa? How far away is China from Arabia? So measuring these kinds of, and answering these kinds of questions. So those are actually two of the questions that he did address, the size of Africa, the shape of Africa, as well as the shape of China, of the Far East, and the distances of these places from Arabia and from Iraq, where he himself was located. And he also, it's very interesting, kind of theorized that the Atlantic Ocean was not just an open sea, but that there was a landmass, so it was enclosed on the other side. And remember, he's looking westward, basically, right? If we have a flat map, he is looking westward. So what he was saying was, like, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't just, once you get to Africa and Spain and France and Britain and all of these places, and you look west from there, it's not just an endless sea. There must be a landmass that is somewhere there in between as well. And he theorized at the time that that landmass was connected to Europe, somewhere very far in the north. And of course, of course, this can be challenged, right? And it's not exactly very accurate, but what's so interesting is that, of course, there is a landmass, and that's probably where you and I are sitting right now as we listen to this, or as I record this. We are sitting in that landmass known as North America, or known as the Americas, right? So it's a very interesting theory that he was developing there. And of course, he also did some work with astrolabes, and he also did some work, astrolabes being the the instrument that is used to basically, again, measure distances by looking at the distances between the planets. And it's, you know, it's a very complex and very multi-use kind of instrument. I don't want to go into like all the details of it, but it's very complex. It requires a lot of knowledge of mathematics, of geometry, as well as astronomy to, you know, write about it, to understand it, and to use it, and to design it, definitely, as well as sundials. Sundials being one of the instruments that was used to measure time, of course, for a very long time in human history. So again, you get a sense that he was very practically oriented, which is why he is one of the few kind of scientific thinkers and intellectuals in history who actually became quite famous and quite influential within his own lifetime, because these were the knowledge that he was producing was immediately useful and so relevant to so many different situations that right after him, and during his own lifetime, but certainly right after him, you start to see people, you know, other scientists, other mathematicians basically pick up where he left off and start to develop all of these different fields of work further, including algebra. People like Umar Khayyam, these are names you might hear sometimes. People like Al-Khwarizmi, right? And Al-Khwarizmi especially being a famous person for scientific notation. So all the squares and the fraction symbol, all the symbols we see in algebra today, Al-Khwarizmi, he lived many centuries after Al-Khwarizmi, and he was the one who developed much of that and then passed it on to Europe. And this is an important point to keep in mind, that it was because of the practicality of how useful the knowledge of Al-Khwarizmi was, that it was some of the first work that was taken from the Muslim lands by European travelers, by traveling thinkers from Europe, and they studied it, they learned Arabic, they studied manuscripts back to Europe, to places like Britain, especially in the UK, first of all. So there's a person named Adelard of Bath from a city called Bath in the UK. So he took manuscripts, he went back to the UK, and he had them translated into at the time. And then slowly those translations started to develop in different languages. And this is how we get words like algebra, right? This is how we get words like algorithm. So nowadays you'll hear a lot of things about algorithm when it comes to social media and search kind of things. Algorithm. The word algorithm is literally Al-Khwarizmi, so Al-Khwarizmi's name, and it's sort of transliterated in European languages, right? So Al-Khwarizmi, algorithm, you can see how one word developed and became another. And algebra, of course, it's very obvious, like I already mentioned. So it would have been great to have more details about Al-Khwarizmi's personal life, what kind of person he was, what were his other achievements, his family life, and what other kinds of things did he get involved in and do, etc. I would love to know all those details. Maybe, inshallah, someday we will find more information about him in the historical records. This is basically a gist, a summary of what we have for the time being. So I hope it's very beneficial for you all. I hope you learned something new, and I hope it inspires you to do a few things. Like I mentioned, make sure you stay open-minded and take beneficial knowledge from wherever that knowledge comes from, and then secondly, have that inspiration and that motivation to develop that knowledge further, especially in ways that are immediately helpful, immediately beneficial, immediately useful and good for society as a whole. Jazakallahu khairan for the opportunity to participate. I hope you guys have a very, very fun Kahoot based on this, and hopefully I will see you again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.